What if I told you that in the depths of a forgotten European castle, there once lived a princess whose feet never touched the ground? Not by choice, not by royal decree, but by something far more sinister. Servants whispered that even in death, as her body lay cold in its ornate coffin, her feet still hovered inches above the silk lining, as if the earth itself refused to claim her. This is the story of Princess Elisabetta di Monteverdi, a tale buried in the archives of the 15th century, hidden away by a family desperate to forget their darkest secret. A secret so disturbing that when the last member of the Monteverdi bloodline died in 1847, they took a fortune to ensure this story would never see daylight again. But tonight, we dig deeper than they ever wanted us to go. The year was 1452. In the remote mountains of what is now northern Italy stood the imposing Castello di Monteverdi, home to Duke Antonio di Monteverdi and his young wife, Duchess Caterina. After 7 years of marriage and countless prayers, the Duchess finally gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Elisabetta. But from the moment she drew her first breath, something was terribly wrong. The midwife, an elderly woman who had delivered hundreds of babies across the region, would later swear on her deathbed that when she placed the infant on the bed, the child's body began to rise. Not floating, she insisted, but as if something beneath was pushing her up. The baby's feet never made contact with any surface. When placed in her crib, she hovered just above the mattress, her tiny form suspended by an invisible force. The Duke and Duchess, desperate to hide what they saw as a curse upon their house, immediately swore all present to secrecy. The midwife was paid a fortune and sent away to a distant village. The few servants who witnessed the birth were either relocated to remote estates or, according to some accounts, simply disappeared. As Elisabetta grew, so did the strangeness surrounding her condition. She could not walk because her feet would not touch the ground. Instead, she glided through the castle corridors, always floating exactly 3 inches above any surface. Stairs posed no obstacle. She would simply drift up or down as if carried by unseen hands. The Duke commissioned special shoes with iron weights in the soles, hoping to anchor his daughter to the earth. But even with 20 pounds of metal strapped to her feet, Elisabetta continued to hover. The shoes would hang beneath her, never making contact with the floor. By age 10, the princess had never experienced the sensation of solid ground beneath her feet. She lived in a constant state of suspension, unable to run and play like other children, unable to dance at the grand balls her father hosted. She became increasingly pale and withdrawn, spending most of her time in the highest tower of the castle, where she would sit by the window, watching the world below through glass she could never step upon. But the most disturbing aspect of Elisabetta's condition was not the floating itself. It was what the servants began to notice lurking in the shadows beneath her. Maria Santangelo, the princess's personal attendant, kept a detailed diary during her 5 years of service. These writings, discovered 3 centuries later during castle renovations, paint a picture of growing horror within the Monteverdi household. According to Maria's entries, dark shapes could often be seen moving beneath the princess, as if her suspended form created a space where something else could exist. The shapes were described as writhing, reaching upward with what appeared to be grasping hands or tendrils. Maria wrote of nights when she would hear scratching sounds coming from beneath the princess's bed, despite Elisabetta floating safely above it. She described whispers in a language she couldn't understand, seeming to emanate from the empty space below the hovering girl. As Elisabetta entered her teenage years, the phenomena intensified. Servants reported that objects would disappear from rooms she frequented, only to be found days later in impossible locations, wedged into cracks in stone walls or buried deep within solid furniture. The temperature would drop dramatically whenever she passed through a room, and mirrors would crack in her presence. The Duke, growing increasingly desperate, consulted with scholars, physicians, and even priests from across Europe. One Venetian scholar theorized that Elisabetta had been born with a rare condition that affected her body's relationship with gravity itself. A German physician suggested she was suffering from a form of hysteria that manifested physically, but it was Father Giuseppe Turretti, a Jesuit priest known for his knowledge of the supernatural, who provided the most chilling explanation. After spending 3 days observing the princess, Father Turretti concluded that Elisabetta was not floating at all. Instead, he believed she was being held suspended by what he termed the hands of the condemned. According to his theory, something had taken root beneath the castle long before the Monteverdi family had built their home there. This entity, he claimed, had been waiting for the right vessel, and had chosen the innocent princess as its anchor to the world above. Father Turretti's recommendation was immediate exorcism, but before the ritual could be performed, something happened that would haunt the Monteverdi family forever. On the night of December 13, 1467, 15-year-old Elisabetta was found dead in her tower room. She had not fallen, for she could not fall. Instead, she hung suspended in the air exactly as she had in life, but now her body was cold and still. The servants who discovered her reported that the dark shapes beneath her had become more solid, more defined, reaching up toward her lifeless form with what appeared to be desperate hunger. What happened next defies rational explanation. As the servants attempted to lower Elisetta's body for burial preparation, they found it impossible to bring her down. Every rope they used would snap, every ladder would collapse. It was as if the same force that had held her aloft in life was determined to keep her suspended in death. For 3 days, her body remained floating in that tower room, while the Duke frantically sought a solution. Finally, they decided to construct the coffin around her suspended form. Master carpenter Lorenzo Bianchi was commissioned to build an elaborate casket that could accommodate the princess's unique condition. The coffin was designed with a false bottom, creating space for whatever invisible force continued to hold her body aloft. But even in death, Elisabetta refused to rest. On the day of her funeral, as the procession made its way to the family mausoleum, witnesses reported that the coffin began to shake violently. The pallbearers struggled to maintain their grip as the ornate box bucked and swayed. Father Turretti, who had remained at the castle to perform the final rites, later wrote that he could hear scratching sounds coming from within the coffin, as if something was trying to claw its way out. When they finally reached the mausoleum, they discovered something that would haunt every person present for the rest of their lives. As they opened the coffin for the final viewing, Elisabetta's body was no longer suspended. She had finally come to rest, her feet touching the coffin's silk lining for the first time in her entire existence. But beneath her, carved deep into the wooden bottom of the casket, were hundreds of scratch marks and what appeared to be crude symbols in a script no one could decipher. The marks were fresh, as if they had been carved from the inside during the funeral procession. As they sealed the coffin and placed it in the family crypt, several mourners reported seeing dark figures moving within the shadows of the mausoleum. The temperature dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the stone walls despite the December day being unusually warm. That night, every mirror in the Castello di Monteverdi shattered simultaneously. The Duke and Duchess never spoke of their daughter again. They commissioned no portrait, erected no statue, had no marker placed on her tomb. It was as if they were trying to erase every trace of Elisabetta's existence from the world. They never had another child, and when the Duke died, 20 years later, local records indicate he was found in his study, staring at a blank wall where a family portrait had once hung, muttering about the hands that lift and the hands that drag. The Duchess survived her husband by only 6 months, found dead in the castle's highest tower, the same room where Elisabetta had spent her final years. She was discovered floating 3 feet above her bed, despite showing no signs of the condition that had plagued her daughter. The Castello stood empty for over 2 centuries, until it was purchased by an English collector in 1845. He planned to restore it as a summer residence. But, after only 3 months of residence, he abandoned the project and had the entire structure demolished. Workers reported that during the demolition of the tower where Elisabetta had lived, they discovered a room beneath her chamber that didn't appear on any of the castle's architectural plans. This hidden room was filled with hundreds of small carved figurines, all depicting a young girl suspended in mid-air. More disturbing still, each figurine showed signs of wear, as if they had been handled constantly over many years. The figurines were made from what appeared to be bone, though analyses later revealed the material to be something far older and more unusual than human remains. The English collector ordered all the figurines to be destroyed, but 3 survived and made their way into private collections across Europe. One resurfaced in a Vienna auction house in 1923, where it was purchased by an anonymous buyer. That figurine was described in the auction catalogue as depicting a female child in eternal suspension. Carved from material of unknown origin, provenance traced to the destroyed Castello di Monteverdi. The buyer's identity was never revealed, but shipping records indicate the figurine was sent to a private address in Prague. That same address was later investigated by authorities after neighbors reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena. They found the apartment empty except for a single room where the wooden floor had been clawed through, revealing deep scratches in the stone foundation below. Today, the land where Castello di Monteverdi once stood remains empty. Local residents report that nothing will grow there, despite the rich mountain soil that supports lush forests in all directions. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, you can see a pale figure drifting above the barren ground, never touching the earth, never finding rest. But perhaps, most disturbing of all, is what recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed about that empty plot of land. Beneath the surface, in the exact location where Elisabetta's tower once stood, there appears to be a vast hollow space, something that suggests the ground itself has been carved away from below. As if whatever held the princess suspended for 15 years continues to dig deeper into the earth, creating a void that grows larger with each passing decade. The local authorities have sealed off the area and refused to discuss their findings, but leaked documents suggest that sensitive equipment has detected movement within that underground cavity. Movement that follows a pattern, rising and falling in a rhythm that matches what witnesses described as Elisabetta's gentle floating motion. Centuries ago, so the next time you feel solid ground beneath your feet, remember the princess who never knew that comfort. Remember that some curses run deeper than death, some forces reach further than the grave, and some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how much gold is spent trying to hide them. And if you ever find yourself walking through the mountains of northern Italy on a moonless night, be careful where you step, because in one particular spot, where a castle once stood and a princess once floated, the earth itself still bears the scars of something that refused to let her go. The hands that lift may be gone, but the hands that drag down remain, always reaching, always searching for the next soul to claim. And they say that if you listen carefully to the wind on those dark nights, you can still hear the whispers in that forgotten language, calling out for someone new to take Elisabetta's place in the endless suspension between earth and sky. Until next time, remember that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some legends are warnings dressed as stories.